Okay, so for the next few weeks, I want to start talking about good premises in argument. We've talked a bit about the form of arguments, and that's really what logic focuses on, is the form rather than sort of the content, right? But I do think to make this useful and to really do anything to evaluate arguments, that has any bearing on the real world, we do need to say a bit about good premises. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on that. Like I said, logic is more focused on the form of arguments than the content, and this is about the content. But I do think we need to say some, or what we do in this class is going to be really incomplete and maybe not super useful for you guys. So today I want to talk a bit about, controversial premises versus plausible premises. And there's a lot of ways to draw this distinction. This is just the best one I can think of. You'll see it put in different ways elsewhere. And so the first thing I want to talk about that really introduces this idea, and I think really rests on it, is this concept of begging the question. Now, one thing I'll say to you guys, you might hear people say, well, that begs the question, whatever, um, you know, people who have dogs live longer. That begs the question of whether it's the same for cats or something, right? People will use this term to mean raises the question or something like that. That's not the way we're going to use it in a logic class. It's something much more specific, something different. And I think it is good to have this sort of term to mark out this concept, this idea. So what does it mean for an argument to beg the question? You'll see this put different ways. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about circular arguments. I think that's a bit misleading because not all question-begging arguments are circular. And people rarely, if ever, make like blatantly circular arguments. They're fun to make fun of. They're maybe not that useful to try to spot bad arguments in the wild. But a question-begging argument is just one that simply, asserts something it needs to prove. And the purest form of a question-begging argument is one that basically states the conclusion or simply assumes the truth of the conclusion in one of its premises. Let me give you guys an example. I think this is from the Lavin reading. It is legitimate and appropriate for the state to put to death someone who commits rape or murder. Therefore, capital punishment is justified for such crimes as rape or murder. Think about this for a minute and think about if you were going to restate these premises, could you sum up what both of them mean in the exact same words? And in fact, you can, right? Capital punishment is morally permissible, therefore capital punishment is morally permissible. Both 1 and 2 are a roundabout way of saying the same thing, right? Now ask yourselves, why is this a bad argument? Why is begging the question not good? Well, look. An argument is supposed to give you reasons to believe some claim. The premise provides support for the conclusion, but if the premise just is the conclusion restated, it doesn't give any reason to think the conclusion is true, right? And anyone who rejects this conclusion is, of course, going to reject this premise. If you don't think capital punishment is morally permissible, then, simply restating this claim that capital punishment is morally permissible in a roundabout way, if you're smart and you think about it, it's not going to change your mind. It's not going to give you any reason to think otherwise than what you started believing, right? Here's another one. Football is dangerous because the players are likely to be injured. Football players are likely to be injured, so football is unsafe, right? Look, what is it for something to be unsafe? Basically, people are likely to be injured. Football players are likely to be injured, so football players are likely to be injured, right? Or you could write it, football is unsafe, so football is unsafe. 1 and 2 say the same thing. 1 gives you no reason to believe 2. What we want here is some proof, some evidence that football players are likely to be injured, right? Hard data, maybe prominent cases. Just repeating they're likely to be injured in different ways does nothing here. But question-begging arguments, it's not just a question-begging argument when one of the premises is basically the conclusion in a restated form, right? And that really doesn't get with the deep issue with question-begging arguments. The deep issue with question-begging arguments is that they assume what they need to prove. Sometimes it's blatantly, we assume the truth of the conclusion and then just repeat it. But other times it's a claim that people need to reach the conclusion that might not be the conclusion, but itself stands in need of some evidence or some proof. And so the best mark of a question-begging argument is that the premises, or at least one of the premises, is no more plausible, no less controversial than the conclusion. Now we're going to talk a lot about what this idea of controversial or plausible means, but one thing I want you to learn now, premises should always be less controversial, more plausible than the conclusion. If there's any premise that is less plausible, more controversial than the conclusion, the argument is a question-begging argument. We'll say a bit more about what this means by controversial, but as a basic idea, controversial means more open to doubt, more easily objected to. Now look, question-begging arguments in some cases just means the conclusion is restated. It can be more subtle, right? Take these two. Taxing the rich to help the poor is theft, so it is wrong. Now look, taxing the rich to help the poor is theft doesn't say the same thing exactly as it's wrong, right? It actually says a lot more than it's wrong, right? But if you say something is theft, well, then theft is wrong, so this is wrong, right? This is actually, an even worse sort of question-begging argument than the earlier ones, right? Because the idea that taxing the rich to help the poor is theft, that's actually more controversial than is the conclusion, right? I mean, think of it this way, right? There are all sorts of reasons that people might object to taxing the rich to help the poor. You might say, well, look, it'll discourage, it's not theft. We tax people for stuff all the time, but if we tax the rich to help the poor, it'll discourage the poor from working. I don't know that that's true. I don't know that it's false, but that is a reason you might think it's wrong to tax the rich to help the poor, and you might think that while rejecting the claim taxing the rich to help the poor is theft. You might think it's not strictly theft, but you might think, well, it's not really fair either if the rich work for what they have. Maybe not quite theft, but still maybe not fair, so it's wrong, right? So the thought is here, this premise, taxing the rich to help the poor is theft, is actually says a lot more, is a lot more easy to object to than this claim that taxing the rich to help the poor is wrong, right? There are many ways you could object to taxing the rich to help the poor while not thinking that it's strictly theft. Right? Which claim are more people going to object to? Taxing the rich to help the poor is wrong, or taxing the rich to help the poor is literally theft? I think less people are going to object to the first one. That's a good sign that it's a less controversial claim. And if your premise is the more controversial claim than your conclusion, then your conclusion, that's sort of textbook case of a question-begging argument. And again, you guys can see why this is a bad argument, why this is not going to do the work people want it to do, right? If you don't believe that it's wrong to tax the rich to help the poor, you sure as heck don't believe that it's out and out theft, right? Anyone who rejects the claim that it's wrong to tax the rich to help the poor is certainly not going to believe that it's theft, right? If you're going to give this person any reasons they might accept, any reasons to change this belief, you need to start with premises they might possibly accept. The same with this one, right? If someone does not accept the claim that capital punishment is wrong, they're certainly not going to accept the claim it's murder, right? And there are many ways to think that capital punishment is wrong, many reasons to think it's wrong that don't involve the claim that it's out and out murder, right? There is, for instance, there's the worry about executing the innocent, right? You might not think, and I tend not to think myself, that capital punishment of the guilty, people who have committed a horrible crime like murder, something like that, you might not think that punishing them with execution is itself murder. You might think it's deserved. But it's possible to think that and think that, well, capital punishment is wrong because there's too much risk of executing an innocent person. Or you might think, and again, there's good evidence for this, that there's a big racial component, that race plays a role in who gets sentenced to death in the US at least, that's unfair, and that's a reason to think capital punishment is wrong. You might think that that's true while also thinking that it's false that capital punishment is murder, right? Plenty of ways to reject or push back on the claim, capital punishment is murder, while still thinking that capital punishment might be wrong. So again, picture of a question-begging argument, because this claim that it's murder is actually is a premise, but it's actually way more controversial than the conclusion. So, we've talked a little bit about what it is for a principle to be more or less plausible, more or less controversial. It's more plausible the less likely someone is to reject it, the less ways there are to object to it. More controversial, the more likely they are to reject it, the more ways they are to object to it. But we'll say a bit more about this. This is another one of those places where things get a little difficult because, argument turns out to be a bit more art than science. There is some room for debate and disagreement here, but it's not hopeless. We can't give, a mathematical formula that will settle this, what is more or less controversial. But I think we can. We do have a fairly good shared concept. We can get some agreement. I'll say more about that next lecture.